Спасибо, да. Мы все-таки переходим к структурализму и его времени, пожалуйста.
Спасибо. Спасибо, Сергей Николаевич, за приглашение на этой конференции и за то, что меня разрешили выступать на английском языке. К сожалению, у меня не было достаточно времени, чтобы я готовил доклад на русском. Но вопросы по докладу вы можете, конечно, задать на русском. Okay, so change to English, just a little switch in my head. Okay, I choose this subject, of course, because I'm familiar with it, but I thought when Sergei offered to contribute to this conference, that structuralism was particularly well suited to the theme, because in a way, the problem of the temporality of ideas, of the time of ideas, is constitutive to what structuralism is, or to be slightly more precise, to the way we define and circumscribe structuralism. In a way, I believe that the very definition of structuralism depends very much on the temporal definition we give to it, or the answer to the question, when was structuralism, when was the time of structuralism. So the time we give to structuralism fundamentally defines what it is, and I'll illustrate this this hypothesis in this presentation, starting with, of course, the problem of the conceptual definition of structuralism. The fact that, as is well known, it is quite difficult to define structuralism from a conceptual point of view, or from, let's say, more traditional historical or historiographical point of view. There's many examples of this difficulty. The first one is a subjective one. I just gave a seminar on structuralism and the European human sciences at the University of Fribourg. And my students were very confused for the few couple of sessions about what exactly we were talking about. So this, of course, might just be a reflection on my incompetence, but I thought I managed to convince them that it was, in fact, also inherent to the difficulty of actually defining and circumscribing structuralism, its basic tenets, and even what it is. Is it a philosophy? Is it a method? Is it a paradigm? Or is it a word we were just talking about, simply a trend? So the second example of this difficulty, and I think that is quite an obvious one, is the sort of paradox inherent in the four stars, or the quatuor, that François Doss, in his very well-known History of Structuralism from the late 90s, chooses. So that's Claude Lévi-Strauss, Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan, and Michel Foucault, each of which is actually not unambiguously a structuralist, especially the last three, Barthes, Lacan, and Foucault, who all in some form and way distanciated themselves from that label. And in a way, the only representative chosen by Dost that can be qualified and has never been contested, or himself never contested the label, is Lévi-Strauss, to the point where in a text from the late 1960s on called Clés pour le structuralisme, so keys to understanding structuralism, Jean-Marie Ozias actually suggests that Lévi-Strauss, c'est le structuralisme. So Lévi-Strauss is structuralism. So here you see this ambiguity, where even in choosing the main heroes of the history of structuralism in the book that is accepted widely as one of the most canonical and accepted version, that it is not actually possible to identify the main figures in a way that is unambiguous, as clear as it would be, for example, if you were speaking of phenomenology or other currents relatively contemporary to structuralism. This difficulty is also expressed, for example, in the very prudent and sort of circumvalated way that Deleuze formulates his famous article from the 70s entitled "À quoi reconnaît-on le structuralisme?" For what, on what features does one recognize structuralism, which is a very explicit way of making obvious that the question itself will not find really an answer, or will implicates the fact that the answer will probably be multiple and not very clear. Otherwise, one would just ask, what is structuralism? And one can also mention the regular seminars organized by Roger Bastide discussing the term structure and its definition. For example, sens et usage du terme de structure, where the problem of the definition is recurrent. This is manifested, I give you one last example really of this definitional conundrum at the heart of structuralism, with the term itself, the apparition of the word structuralism, which has a double mystery to it. First of all, that it appears much later than the movement itself, and that it's not clear among a lot of researchers of structuralism when it appeared. So, for example, in the article by Christian Puech and Schiss, I can't remember his first name, I'm sorry, Jean-Louis, I think, who are two well-known experts of structuralism and Saussure, they suggest that the word structuralism actually appears in the famous article by Ernst Cassirer, Structuralism in Modern Linguistics, published in the first volume of the Word in 1945. That is absolutely and clearly wrong. The first time the word is used to, and explicitly to characterize the movement of structuralism is, of course, in an article by Roman Jakobson, published in 1929 in Czech and called Romantické všeslovanství, nová slavistika. That's the first occurrence, at least known to me. This may be an earlier one. It's also used in 1933 by Nikolai Trubetskoy in La phonologie actuelle, and in the title of an article published in 1939 by the philosopher and linguist Hendrik Poss, called Perspectives du structuralisme, Perspectives of Structuralism, where he explicitly discusses the philosophical implication of Prague phonology. So here you see not only the problem of definition, but also of the terminology and the historical determination of when that terminology was used. Even in by highly regarded serious specialists, you will find mistakes such as the one that says that Cassirer was the first to formulate the term structuralism. So, given this problem of definition, and may I add, I haven't even had to talk about the conceptual content. of structuralism, of the decision of deciding what are its main notions or what it's all about. It seems even impossible to decide who was a structuralism and what part of their work was actually structuralist, and whether using that label is valid or not. And that is a true also of major figures such as Saussure, and of the above-mentioned French structuralists such as Michel Foucault or Roland Barthes. So usually the solution to this definitional problem, and of the scope also of what might possibly be included under the banner, under the term of structuralism, is to define it as an epochal moment, constricted in time, and with a precise location, which is Paris, and the time is the post-war, 20 years period after the post-war, from 1945 to the end of the 60s. Some like to use the events of May 1968 as symbolizing the transition from classical French structuralism to the post-structuralist phase. But more or less, the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s marks the end of structuralism in most accounts, typically that of François Doss. This is also what you'll find in widely available descriptions, including, for example, Wikipedia. And this story of structuralism is, of course, well known. Saussure is presented as a sort of anticipator, a source of inspiration, with actually the real father figure, with the real influence being Claude Lévi-Strauss, that expanded structuralism to all disciplines in the human fields, and that led to a period of almost ubiquitous domination of the structuralist way of thinking or cultural approach until its refutation, both in its field of origination, that is linguistics, by Noam Chomsky and generative linguistics, and more widely by post-structuralist hermeneutical and other types of critiques. I won't go into details of this historiographical picture, which I've written and which I think is a very limited, but what is important here are two characteristics, is that it decides very consciously to define structuralism as a punctual episteme, so to use Foucault's saying, or as a current of thought or a particular cultural approach to science, a circumscribed tradition emanating from a milieu. So it's, you see there's a very, from this decision of positing structuralism in a specific time, also flows a characterization, a definitional characterization of what structuralism was. And I've used the more neutral terms. Quite often, one will also suggest that it was just a trend in mode that came and went, implying also that it had very little long-lasting influence, that it was a fad. That's another word in the English language to express the idea of a mode or a trend, and implies even more something superficial. And that's the second aspect, is that by locating structuralism so clearly temporally, one emphasizes that it is now dead. That's a word that is quite often used. One says structuralism is dead, and has been so for almost 50 years, and is not a school that has a living tradition and defenders in comparison to many other important trends of the 20th century. Let's take psychoanalysis, Marxism, phenomenology, or the different variations of analytical philosophy, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and so on, which have both institutionally and, let's say, in the life of ideas, a continuous existence that structuralism lost in the 70s already, for the most part. So that's both, in a way, the consequence of the decision, a historiographical decision or interpretative decision to circumscribe structuralism to its Parisian moment, and also a sort of objective remark on the fact that it is true that structuralism has not had the institutional and let's say research life that the other currents I just mentioned have had since the 70s. That being said, as I also shortly mentioned, the limitations to this decision of circumscribing structuralism to its Parisian moment are very obvious, and it's not difficult to find other times of or for structuralism. That's why I explicitly chose the plural form in my title, where there's a multiplicity of times, and the Parisian moment is one of many. I'll add here that this plurality is something that's accepted also by a number of commentators of structuralism, in particularly Ernst Cassirer, Jean Piaget in his text Le Structuralisme, also from the late 60s, 1968, or more recently Jean Petitot, all provide genealogies of structuralism that see its roots certainly before the Second World War, and often in the late 19th century, starting, for example, with Gestalt psychology or revolution in mathematics conducted by the Bourbaki group and people like David Hilbert. So this multiplicity of structuralist times is not something that is absent even in accepted canonical account of structure in the West. Needless to say, of course, that the obvious one-dimensional aspect of this characterization is obvious to anyone in Russia, where the exclusion of the Russian contributions of the Russian structuralist tradition is obvious. But I'll come to this point in a second. So now what I'll do is just comment on a few of these other structuralist times, keeping in mind that they are not interested only as a sort of a refutation of the limitation of structuralism to its Parisian moment, but that they also evidence the problem of the temporal determination for their own for the way they themselves belong to structuralism. So I'm not just giving a few examples of other practices of structuralism that fall without the short period from 1945 to the late 60s in Paris. I'm also offering a comment that all these other examples are marked by a problem of temporality in defining what these structuralist moments were about. I hope this becomes clear with the examples, and I'll start with the first one, which is, of course, structuralism in the Russian and Soviet context. In a way, it is undeniable and obvious that there was such a tradition, but when it comes to identifying it, again, we're confronted with a problem. So the most obvious solution would be to start with the Tartu Moscow school, but they, in a way, they never, or they had a complicated relation with the label structuralism and chose that of semiotics. And also, this is starting much too late because there are other examples of structuralist thought. That is, of course, Russian formalism, and in a more complicated way, the work ongoing at the Gachen, the Academy of Artistic Science in Moscow. What is important here is that these three, and what could add a few more, there's some individual examples of thinkers that integrated structuralist thought in their work to such an extent that one could consider them structuralists. I'll mention here, for example, the Georgian philosopher Kita Megrelidze, but I'll keep focused on the three schools: Russian formalism, the Gachen, and the Tartu Moscow school. And what is immediately clear from this characterization of structuralism in Russia or in the Soviet Union is that it's non-continuous, it's non-linear, and also it's non-explicit, because none of the three schools actually thought of themselves as structuralists or had an unequivocal relation to that label. And also they all were competing or discussing between each other on the interpretation they would give to some of the main structuralist ideas that they put forward, such as the concept of text, of system, and of the systematic nature of historical evolution. Even in defining another structuralist time, as it developed and evolved in Russia and in the Soviet Union, we confronted with this question of the temporal determination and of the definition it will provide of structuralism there. Because if you choose, for example, to say, well, actually the Tartu school was semiotics and it's only influenced to a secondary degree by structuralist thought, and is in a way not even compatible with, let's say, the French semiotics of the same time, and that you'll defend the real contributor to structuralist thought in Russia were the Russian formalists, then you're giving, let's say, you're characterizing the role of structuralism in Russia as a sort of proto-structuralism that then was transferred to Prague, and that sort of ended for some time and was again resuscitated later, but in a very different form. If you choose to try and include a longer temporality and add the three schools I mentioned and plus other contributors, you will find some debates that remain the same, or that constitute continuations, and that there is no clear, for example, point of demarcation on Russian formalism and Prague structuralism, as demonstrated sort of physically by the fact that Roman Jakobson was in Prague from the early 1920s, even before the foundation of the Prague linguistic circles, and in correspondence with Tynyanov until the late 20s. So you again, the temporal limitation you will put on structuralism, what you will include in what you want to define as structuralism, will influence what structuralism was in Russia. Was it just a sort of horizon or target or a consequence of ideas developed by the Russian formalists in polemics with the Gachen, or was it a sort of shared terrain where, on which new ideas were exchanged? And that depends in a way on the fact that you decide to give a datation to the presence of structuralist ideas in Russia and the Soviet Union, let's say from the 1910s to the late 1970s. Or if you take out only small episodes that are linked to actually the main trend that was in France. A second example of the problem of datation is Prague. In a way, Prague is the most easiest part of structuralism to define, because it is the one where you have an institution that is explicitly and always was explicitly structuralist, which is the Cercle Linguistique, which has a foundation date 1926, which has thesis 1928, and which has an end, which is sort of a slow but quite clear. First 38 with the death of Trubetskoy and the exile of Jakobson, and then after the communist putsch with Mukarzowski's denial of structuralist thesis. So then you could say this is the easiest part, 1926, 1948, Prague structuralism with the Prague phonology, structural aesthetics, and so on. If you look at the Prague context, you notice though that there is a lot of structuralism or theorizing that can be labeled as structuralism, as structuralist, going on before 1926. First of all, Jakobson arrives in the 20s, and then you have Gestalt psychology, which is not usually associated with Prague, but that is where Ernst Mach taught for a while, and where Ehrenfels published his Gestalt Qualitäten. And a lot of these ideas are taken up by Anton Marti later, and a lot of the Prague Brentano school was tightly linked with the development of Gestalt psychology, and especially developments that went in the direction of structuralism. One can mention, for example, their interaction here with Karl Bühler. So you have here now not the start of Prague structuralism with the foundation of the Cercle Linguistique de Prague, but already a sort of background going on since the late 19th century. And this is made all the more evident when one takes into account the development of the notion of Formgefühl, so the sensation of form with in the history of psychology, which is in a way an ancestor of Gestalt psychology. That's certainly the tradition from which Ehrenfels takes his own idea of Gestalt, and which is in a way dependent on what was the canonical psychological theory in the Czech, well, that wasn't the Czech Republic at the time. So in the Czech part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and which was the psychology of Herbart. And you can see this influence persist very strongly also in the later work of Prague aesthetics, for example, in Mukarzowski and so on. One can add, this is a bit more anecdotal, but the fact that Albert Einstein taught in Prague in 1911 to 12 and came into contact with the Brentanist circles. And you see here that you have a whole background of structural thought that, again, forces us to ask the question, is it okay, is it correct to date, to situate structuralism temporally in these 20 years in the interwar period, or if one wants to understand what happened there and give a correct interpretation, to take into account a larger context on the one hand, but also more importantly, a longer history. And this is true more generally, that once start going down this road, and this applies to the Russian context as well, that one is driven to extend the boundaries of structuralism into the past, generally up to Kant, and to include major figures such as Goethe and Wilhelm von Humboldt, to whom one can retrace quite clear genealogical lines, which are themselves plural. So, for example, you will find the influence of Humboldt in Russia through Steinthal, Potidnia, Bieli, and so on. But you will find it also in Prague. And Goethe is also a recurrent figure. So in a way, once you start pushing that time barrier into the past, you can make the history of structuralism reach much further into the past. And the same applies then, and this is the last example of the post-structuralist cutting point, if you want. And it is in a way not at all clear to what extent, for example, someone like Foucault or Julia Kristeva were structuralists, and at what point they weren't anymore. To take the example of Kristeva, her whole role is generally portrayed as being a sort of a moment of transition whereby bringing Bakhtinian ideas, she criticizes some of the main structuralist ideas, but in fact, what you see happening is the continuation of the main intuitions, such as the notion of text, of the notion of systematic organization, of hierarchies, and in a way, a lot of the new insights proposed by Kristeva or by Jacques Derrida are only possible on the back or as a continuation of structuralist insight. To use Eugen Fink, which Michael mentioned just before, structuralism is still operative in these theories. These theories are just not thinkable and not possible without what came before. And it is not at all clear at what point Derrida is not a structuralist anymore, for example, or if one wants to avoid this sort of labeling, at what point structuralist elements disappear or become so less prevalent in his work that they can be safely characterized as belonging to a paradigm that is different from structuralism. And that applies to almost all post-structuralist thinkers. Deleuze is a very good example. For example, when in his article, À quoi remet-on le structuralisme, he sort of has this axiomatic summary of what is important to what defines structuralism, and in a way is a sort of explicitation of his own theory, where there's a sort of laying bare of the structuralist devices in Deleuze, at the precise moment where he is, in fact, he's proposing an interpretation, his interpretation of structuralism. So here again, one sees that there's no distinct moment of end. So whether back in the past, on some of the canonical moments, so that be Prague structuralism, the Russian and Soviet contributions, or even French structuralism itself, are all subject to this I wouldn't say chronological indetermination, but a chronological problem, or at least problem of the situation in time. Here, of course, I use time in a very historical, cultural sense, of a sort of not at all, let's say, a purely date-based concept. Although I've used quite a lot, but to underline the diversity of the inscriptions of these moments. But the dates themselves, of course, are not that important. To conclude, or to go towards my conclusion, there are two main options, basically, that one then has to make sense of this diversity that is, as I've tried to insist, chronological, but or linked to time, but also geographical and disciplinary. I mean, the interdisciplinarity of structuralism is well known, but it's also really an element that has to be recalled now and then. So there's basically two solutions. One is to accept simply that one has to do with a number of micro traditions or separate traditions that had various relations to one another, either that influenced or that run paralleled or that were a polemical other, that in some cases were ignored, and one of which the French structuralist tradition imposed itself as sort of the dominating model. That is, I would suggest, the image we have of structuralism generally. That is one main tradition that was linked in interesting but peripheral and not fundamentally essential to its development, where the French tradition is in a way self-contained, and yes, there are other examples which have interesting elements to them, usually only insofar as they are related to the French tradition. For example, Jacobson is mainly interesting as an inspiration for Levi-Strauss or as a co-author of Levi-Strauss, and so on. So in a way, the adding these different temporalities or discussing this temporal element is not enough to question what structuralism is. So this definition as a cultural moment, as a specific school of thought that has been mostly overcome. But one can also take the decision of trying to find or to accept the commonality that there is between all these positions. I completely accept that on each of the examples I've given, be that Gestalt psychology, be that, for example, especially the older sources such as Goethe and Humboldt, one can argue whether it's anachronistic or really justified to use the structure's characterization. But there are both, let's say, development lines. There are both terminological and conceptual continuities that which we don't need to posit, but which that can help actually understand the ideas, the more mature ideas of structure, such as the system. I think one of the best examples of that remains Patrick Sério's book, where he shows the importance of non-structuralist ideas of totality and of organicism to the constitution of the core and key structuralist concepts. So even with a certain lax approach or a certain generosity in what we decide to include, one is still confronted with a certain unity of these different traditions, and one can decide to ignore it, or one can decide to try and explain it or give an interpretation to it, and in that way then we would come to the idea that structuralism is best understood not as a constellation of traditions that formed in different contexts and evolved different ways, but as sort of a fundamental paradigm or way of thought that should be put on the level, for example, of categories such as idealism and empiricism. One author to defend a thesis that goes a bit in this sense is the German philosopher Heinrich Rombach in his book Substanz, System, Struktur, die Hauptepochen der europäischen Geistesgeschichte. I've read that with I don't know, sort of Dutch accent, I'm sorry. So it's substance, system, structure, the main epochs of European human sciences or a history of the spirit. And where the idea is to say, basically, the main intuition of structuralism, which is to treat any object in any discipline basically as a structure, whatever that might mean in detail, is something that is so fundamental that it implies that it is not a school or a certain way of thinking that is linked to a moment, but is to be thought more profoundly as a basic way of understanding the world, such as idealism, empiricism, and so on. And that idea comes from a consideration on the temporal anchoring and inscription of structuralism, of the fact that it has this sort of moments where it crystallizes more and is linked in obvious but also complicated ways with other traditions. And it seems to evolve and produce ideas that become more precise, or that are refined, or that stay in a polemical stalemate. That's not important. But where one decides to apply this longer time to structuralism, its definition changes from a tradition, a school that's comparable to phenomenology or Marxism, to a certain way of thinking that one should put into comparison more with idealism and empiricism. And if one accepts that, then of course, the question of the time of structuralism changes again, because then we would still be in the time of structuralism. So, спасибо большое. That's it from me.
Спасибо за ваш доклад, очень богатый по фактическому материалу. Пожалуйста, вопросы. Мне кажется, что Сергей Николаевич хочет задать вопрос.
Спасибо. Честно говоря, я собирался не задавать вопросы, а просто прокомментировать выводы из этого доклада. По-моему, доклад Патрика Флака подтверждает в очередной раз общую проблему зыбкости и неопределенности исторических понятий, с которыми прекрасно знакомы все историки, не только интеллектуальные. Какие-нибудь там, скажем, государства меняют свои границы и названия, нации, расы скрещиваются, разделяются, сливаются и так далее. А уже в культурной области постоянно приходится иметь дело, что разные течения, школы и тренды переходят друг друга и внутри себя разделяются на какие-то неопределенные подмножества. В них приходится описывать такие объекты, приходится, видимо, пользоваться понятием не логического класса, а логического типа, как еще Джон Стюарт Миль разделял в свое время эти два инструмента мышления. Тип определяется тем, что у него есть центр и периферии, хорошие примеры и более сомнительные периферийные примеры, представители. Вот примерно так же и в случае со структурализмом, как и с другими интеллектуальными направлениями, приходится учитывать, что в них есть некоторые хорошие представительные фигуры, скажем, вот Леви-Стросс для структурализма в самом деле в самом центре. Есть люди и сочинения, которые уже находятся на периферии его, преодолевают его, даже, может быть, оспаривают его в каких-то аспектах. И более того, в совсем предельном случае можно задаться вопросом о том, не принадлежат ли к этому направлению его позднейшие историки. Вот, скажем, Патрик Флак, исследующий структурализм, а не может ли он тоже считаться структуралистом? В самом деле, это согласуется с вашим выводом, потому что мы до сих пор находимся во времени структурализма. Наверное, с таким принципом не все согласятся, конечно. Понятно, что историк нацизма не будет себя отождествлять с этим направлением. Но, тем не менее, сложность границ, которые здесь приходится проводить, действительно очевидна. Спасибо.
Спасибо. Но что касается ваш пункт, что историк принадлежит к самому движению, это в случае структурализма совсем очевидно, что просто почти все структуралисты дали какое-то историческое высветление, это по-русски? Explanation. Объяснение. И сам Якобсон, сам Трубецкой, и потом Делез, а так далее. Так это на самом деле так. И я не совсем уверен, если я понял, что вы сказали, что я как историк структурализма так и принадлежу структурализму. Или я сам структуралист. Это я хорошо понял.
Это вопрос.
Ага.
Возможно,
Ну,
гипотеза.
я бы согласился с этой характеризацией. Это не как ну, слоган или как-то, но если кажется, что в этом смысле это не только историческая работа, но и дальше развитие самого концептуального ядра. Так я с этим соглашаюсь, да. И если возвращаюсь к семинарии, который я дал, первый час был классики, а второй были историки, Пиаже, Делез, а так далее. И это принадлежит, по-моему, к движению. И тоже потому, что он не только закотлен в этих исторических явлениях, но каждый, кто попробует это, замыслить над этим, каким-то образом и принадлежит к этой.
Пожалуйста, вопросы, дальнейшие вопросы, замечания, может быть.
Можно мне вопрос?
Да.
Я задам его тогда по-русски в продолжение вопроса Сергея Николаевича. Но, коллега, пожалуйста, отвечайте по-английски, если это удобнее. Я бы хотел добавить еще один случай сложный, случай споров о том, кто структуралист, а кто нет. И в этом контексте, мне кажется, интересно подумать о Тартусской школе. Я не очень много знаю об этом, может быть, вы знаете больше, или, может быть, другие коллеги. Но известно, что Лотман относился с большим скепсисом к каким-то компонентам французского структурализма и, кажется, в целом к некой легкомысленности французского структурализма, прежде всего я говорю о Барте. Но это то, что я слышал просто от тех, кто с Лотманом разговаривал. Потому что было просто интересно собрать, пока еще есть возможность, некий устное свидетельство о том, что Лотман думал. Я вот не знаю про разные фигуры. Он точно думал, ничего про Кристию хорошего не думал. Вот хотел спросить об этом. Да? Как русская традиция, она не только периферийная, а это периферийная традиция, которая претендует на то, что она есть настоящая, а то, что говорит во Франции, это в каком-то смысле либо это некое паразитирование. Леви-Стросс берет у Пропа, берет у Каптона, и дальше начинается какая-то чепуха. В общем, что-то в таком роде. Хотел просто спросить у вас, и, может быть, Сергей Николаевич что-то про это знает тоже.
Так,
пожалуйста.
Что касается деталей вопроса, контакте и так далее, я не очень знаю, потому что я вообще не специалист Тартусской школы. Но что касается общий вопрос о роли периферии и центра, это очень центральный пункт историографии структурализма. Этот вопрос. Как принадлежать, например, русской традиции и пражской традиции, какая функция у нее была на самом деле, если можно так выразиться. Это не так, что французский структурализм мог развить без этой традиции. Они там оперативную роль имели. Это этот парадокс, что историография представляет эти традиции как различные, но это тоже можно видеть эти коммуникации. И я не хочу употреблять слово «влияние», потому что не ходится, it doesn't fit, но можно и говорить о сетях, networks, и так далее. И в этом смысле совсем не ясно, что традиции, как русский формализм, правильно считать как периферные в истории структурализма. Они можно и написать истории структурализма, где они центральны. И история, где принадлежит французский структурализм. To be clear, I'll just switch in English. I mean, you can write a history of structuralism where the Prague and Russian contributions are central, even though you include French structuralism. It's not that you focus on that part of the history, which is usually the case. People will write about Prague structuralism or Russian formalism, but you can write a general history of structuralism where what are usually considered as peripheral and preparatory stages are actually the central moment. So the question of center and periphery is actually also in play in the historiography of structuralism. And in a way, I think it's, that's this is an opinion, a strong one, but actually it would be more correct to write the history of structuralism in that way than with the focus on Lévi-Strauss and the French part. But that's debatable, of course.
Я позволю себе одну реплику по этому поводу. Я думаю, что вот это ревнивое отношение Юрия Михайловича Лотмана к Кристьевой, и не только Лотмана, к Кристьевой, скажем, Вячеслав Всеволодович Иванов тоже очень скептически относился к французскому структурализму 60-х годов, что все это было наследием, восходит к русскому авангарду, да, наследие которого Московская Тартовская школа возрождала. Каждая футуристическая группа, там эго-футуристы или кубофутуристы считали себя единственными представителями подлинного авангарда, подлинного нового искусства. И вот это возрождение забытого в эпоху тоталитаризма русского авангарда в Московской Тартовской школе дало вот этот странный рефлекс ревнивости по отношению к близко родственным явлениям на Западе. Я бы не стал это возводить к такому великодержавному шовинизму. Нет, это именно авангардистская традиция. Прошу прощения, то, что я вмешался.
Я тоже вмешаюсь.
Вопросы?
Я тоже вмешаюсь, поскольку Борис Васлов ко мне еще обращался. Совсем коротко. Отношение Лотмана, поскольку было речь о Лотмане к французской теории, сам деле очень сложный вопрос. Я как раз недавно написал об этом статью, которая будет напечатана по-английски в Companion to Lotman. Лотман, безусловно, ценил французский структурализм в строгом смысле слова. Он активно опирался на Lévi-Strauss, не раз его цитировал. Это был на него, в самом деле, один из главных ориентиров, может быть, даже больше, чем Сосюр. Что касается Барта, то его отношение к Барту сильно эволюционировало. Просто в 60-е годы, из года в год. Сначала он писал, что Барт написал лучшее во Франции, а может быть во всем мире, изложение семиотической теории, имел сюда основу семиологии, и даже начинал переводить текст французского. А уже буквально через год-другой вычеркивает имя Барта из перечня ведущих структуралистов мира, а письма своих отзываются о нем все хуже и хуже, как об эссеисте. Имеется в виду простая вещь. Произошло расхождение хронологической эволюции французского и советского структурализма. Если советский структурализм держался научных позиций, то французский довольно быстро эволюционировал в сторону полунаучной, полулитературной деятельности. По этой же причине Барт относился скептически к Кристьевой. То есть она его интересовала прагматически, как человек, знающий два языка, русский и французский, готовый послужить посредником в распространении тарtusских идей, но собственные сочинения, на самом деле, были ему совершенно далеки. В общем, здесь, по-моему, более конкретные исторические обстоятельства, чем вы, Игорь Павлович, предлагаете. Это не общая типология культурных форм, а конкретная конъюнктура интеллектуальных траекторий в двух странах, переживавших совершенно разные эпохи своего развития.
Ну, это нет, все-таки я останусь при своем мнении. Я могу привести несколько анекдотов просто из давней истории. Когда-то я написал статью для то ли для Большой советской энциклопедии, то ли для краткой литературной энциклопедии, сейчас уже не помню, под названием «Структурализм». Вячеслав Всеволодович Иванов написал на эту статью крайне отрицательную рецензию, потому что я там похвалил французский структурализм, только поэтому. Нет, значит, у нас есть своя собственная традиция, и мы должны подчеркивать именно ее.
Вы, может быть, знаете, что первоначально статью должен был писать Лотман, и он ее написал,
Да,
но ее отвергли.
Да. Ну, сложная история.
Кстати говоря, еще отвечая на вопрос Бориса Маслова, сбор информации в отношении тартусских структуралистов в структурализме мировом идет, по крайней мере, в отношении Лотмана идет очень интенсивный процесс публикации материалов его архива в Таллине. И там как раз публикуются и письма, и ранние публикации, даже не опубликованные тексты этих лет. А тут очень много видно как раз об отношении Лотмана к структурализму. Особенно рекомендую уже вышедший сборник «Лотман о структурализме», так и называется.
Мы отвлеклись немножко в сторону, а может быть и нет. Прошу задавать вопросы. Ну, если больше нет никаких замечаний, то еще раз спасибо за доклад, и мы теперь переходим к следующему